In this lecture, we're going to talk about how to get the most professional looking photos and be fast enough with your settings that you could photograph a wedding or sporting event. So when I talk about professional looking photos, there's kind of this look that you'll see in a lot of high-end photos that you don't see so much with a smartphone. And that look is a shallow depth of field. Now there's obviously a lot of other things that go into a great photo, like good composition and lighting, but typically that shallow depth of field look will set your photos apart from your typical smartphone photo. Now, if you remember from the lighting section, the way you get the most shallow depth of field is by having the largest aperture. An important thing to note is different lenses have different apertures. So a lot of times a lens that can like zoom in and out, a telephoto lens, might have an aperture of around 4 or 2.8, and that's the very lowest it can go. Whereas a prime lens, a lens that cannot zoom in and out, will typically have an aperture that goes as low as 1.2 or 1.4 or even 1.8, which is a big difference from f-stop 4 or 2.8. You don't have to spend a lot of money to get a prime lens. In fact, they're sometimes the cheapest lenses on the market, or a pancake lens. So to summarize that, getting the most shallow depth of field, you'll want to get a lens that has a really low f-stop. Now you can do this cheap, so with like Canon lenses, they have what's called the Nifty 50. So for around $100, it's a 51.8 lens, and it'll give you a pretty shallow depth of field. Now on your camera settings, there's the auto setting that I don't recommend using. And most people say, hey, you don't want to use auto, you want to use manual to be a professional, but they don't tell you why. And the main reason why is because in auto, it's choosing your aperture for you. Instead, you want to come over to aperture priority. In the aperture priority setting, what you're doing is you're setting your own aperture and you're setting your own ISO, and then the camera chooses the shutter speed for you based on how much light's available. The important thing to note here is once you choose your aperture and your ISO, if you have the right ISO setting, then you can just go around snapping photos, and you could be at a wedding or sporting event, and almost every photo should be the right exposure. Now, if that's not happening, or the subject looks too blurry or something like that, it's probably because your ISO is not high enough because there's not enough light available. So you could either bring in a light source or you could turn up your ISO, but you don't want to turn up your ISO unless you have to. But essentially the best camera setting is you just set it to aperture priority, you set your ISO to 100, you set your iris or aperture to the very lowest number that you can, and from there, you just treat it as if it's auto. It's not, it's manual because you're choosing your ISO and you're choosing your aperture. But it will automatically do your shutter speed for you. So you can walk around and almost every photo should be perfect exposure. And it's going to be done with the correct aperture to give you the shallowest depth of field. Now, another factor that affects your shallow depth of field is the distance between your subject and the background, and the distance between your subject and the camera. So the closer I bring the camera to the subject, the shallower the depth of field is going to be, and the further I put the background from the subject, the shallower the depth of field is going to be. And then I can't talk about getting a good looking photo without mentioning at least basic composition. So the first thing to understand is rule of thirds. Instead of having your subject perfectly centered in the middle, whatever you want the photo to be focused on, you would put that where the thirds intersect. And so a lot of times you'll have it be one of the subject's eyes, and you'll put their eye right on that rule of thirds. Another piece of good composition that is really simple that so often isn't done well is just having a level horizon. So especially if you're taking photos of an ocean or anything where you can really clearly see straight lines or horizon, make sure that those straight lines are straight, and it makes a really big difference for your composition. And the final tip for creating those high-end photos is learn to tell a story in one frame. So when you capture a photo, it's not just about the main subject or whatever it might be, but try to capture the subject, where they're in, the emotion they're feeling, and tell a full story in just that one photo. So now that you understand how to get a lens with a large aperture, set your camera to aperture priority, choose your ISO, you can go around and take photos just on the fly that are great exposure and that are going to have the shallowest depth of field. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about taking really good looking portrait photos or photos of people.